This is Lindsay O'Donnell Welch with Decipher. So, ransomware continues to be a big issue in the cybersecurity space, and one group has put a ton of thought over the years into how we can best approach this issue from all angles. That's the Ransomware Task Force, which is a group of key stakeholders across industry, government, and civil society. And in 2021, this task force released 48 recommendations for how we can best combat ransomware. So this week, the Ransomware Task Force released its third annual report looking at where we are in terms of implementing these recommendations and disrupting ransomware overall. I'm here today to talk about this latest report with the Institute for Security and Technology's Megan Stifel, Chief Strategy Officer at IST and Ransomware Task Force Co-Chair, and Taylor Grossman, Deputy Director for Digital Security at IST. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so Megan and Taylor, in this latest report, the task force shows that only 24 of the 48 recommended measures have made significant progress since 2021. And these address everything from how we can best prepare ourselves for ransomware attacks to how we can collaborate with other governments to target the threat actors or how we can disrupt ransomware models themselves. What are the biggest and most pressing recommendations today that haven't yet been fully implemented that we really need to address here?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing right now is that we've made some really good strides to get some good mechanisms kind of on the table for governments and industry to start using. And what we're really looking for is now that resource allocation to really kind of start to put in place structures that will make those policies really have teeth moving forward. So, for example, something we're seeing a lot is around harmonizing incident reporting mechanisms. So CERCIA. That was put in place in 2022, and that's a really big step forward in trying to harmonize incident reporting and really trying to get a better picture of the threat so that we can then disrupt, deter, respond accurately, and also prepare accurately. However, there's been a huge lead time into the implementation of that report, of that act. So the CISA, which is in charge of sort of the rulemaking around that reporting mechanism, they just released their notice of public rulemaking on April 4th of this month. There'll be 2 months for the public to comment, and then that will go into an 18-month period when that will be finessed into an actual reporting rule. So that's one of the examples of areas where, again, we're seeing really big strides forward, but we need to kind of hone the details to get that right so that those reporting mechanisms are streamlined, are really useful for victims of ransomware, and also for enforcement bodies, law enforcement, regulators, et cetera, to get the information that they need to tackle the threat head on.
Definitely. And I know there was one interesting piece in the report too that you mentioned about kind of the potential need, or not need, but like the potential of reporting ransom payments as well, before they're made. I thought that was a really interesting part, just given the nature of cyber incident reporting and how this could potentially help in that area. Could you go a little bit more into what the benefits of that might be?
Sure. Yeah. So right now we're seeing a lot more, both in CERCIA and the New York Department of Financial Services, the SEC, have put in place mechanisms where different entities, if it's the SEC, a publicly traded company, if you fall under a financial services organization, then that's based in New York, then it's the New York Department of Financial Services, where you need to actually report if you've made a ransom payment. What the RTF has advocated for is actually contacting the government, be that law enforcement and regulators, before actually making a ransom payment. The idea not being that we understand that in a lot of cases there's a real cost benefit analysis to be made, but we want to make sure that actors, particularly victims, are really thinking about if payment is the right option for them. In a lot of cases, it can lead to more hardship going forward. So we haven't seen actual legal implementation of that yet. But I think one of the big things is that the earlier you loop in the government and agencies and law enforcement, the quicker that they can act to actually follow the money, to start to trace some of these transfers. Unfortunately, ransomware actors have become very good at basically laundering and re-laundering money so that it's harder and harder to track. And so, even if you decide to make the payment, bringing in the government early to help essentially to watch that process unfold and get eyes on the ground would be really helpful. We've also advocated again for more sort of cost benefit analysis and a streamlined cost benefit analysis for organizations to really think through what the pros and cons are of making a ransom payment before they do so. Megan, do you have anything to add?
No, I think a good example of this, although I don't know that it's totally clear in the public record, Lindsay, is with the Colonial Pipeline, with the ability to seize most of the proceeds of that payment. The law enforcement community and the government has been open about having had a working relationship as that payment was being made, and so I think that there's good evidence there that could be built upon to make a better case that, as Taylor said, contact the government early and often, as opposed to waiting to after the fact because of the ways that these actors try to obfuscate their tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely, a lot of benefits that go into kind of cyber incident reporting and a lot of those details that have been outlined in the report there. I wanted to ask too, another piece that was mentioned in the report is kind of disrupting ransomware operations at scale. And that was highlighted by the task force as needing potentially, we still have ways to go in that area. And one of the challenges with ransomware, and this has been highlighted in the past 2, 3 years by the task force as well, is this concept of safe havens and how ransomware actors have, certain countries outside the US, especially Russia, are providing safe havens for these ransomware threat actors. That's providing a huge challenge when it comes to potentially dealing with these actors. And we've seen sanctions, we've seen indictments, and we've seen a level of international collaboration when it comes to disruptions that have been disclosed, but it's really hard to measure the impacts of these disruptions. Can you talk a little bit about where we are right now in terms of these types of ransomware operations and kind of where we want to get to and how we need to get there?
Yeah, so I think the really good news is that we're seeing through the CRI, the International Counter Ransomware Initiative, a lot of countries are signing on to that and working together to share information and collaborate and bring their law enforcement agencies together to really kind of pull the pieces together. Again, as we've talked about, ransomware actors have been very good at kind of skirting jurisdictions and, again, washing money over and over again until it's very, very hard to trace. So the more countries that you get involved in that process of actually tracking the money, the better chance you have of disrupting the operation. And we've seen some really major takedowns in the last few months and year, right? So the Lockbit takedown in February that was really spearheaded by the U.S. and the U.K. I think was a great effort. They gathered a lot of intelligence, and despite what some of the Lockbit folks on the dark web might say about being able to reform immediately, they've lost a lot of credibility in the community, and there's been a lot of intelligence work done by the U.S. and the U.K. governments to really hamper that ransomware as a service provider going forward. Again, I think one of the problems here is that it's easy for ransomware actors to regroup, reform. A lot of actors are not as sophisticated as others and can kind of, sort of sort of operate run-of-the-mill operations as easily as they want. And so I think the purpose of disruptions is really to throw as much sand in the gear as possible. So to keep working towards making this kind of everyday news that we are disrupting groups, we're making it harder for them to profit, we're making them known entities across law enforcement so that people know about, the Hive ransomware group or Alpha V, Black Cat, however you call it, Lockbit group, so that, folks are actually feeling the repercussions and aren't just able to kind of, all right, so that access point was squandered. Let's pick up and move on. I think the disruptions that we're seeing are affecting bottom lines. They're still active, which is the problem, and they are still able to kind of reform, or parts of them reform, and they're not happening as frequently as we'd like to see. So that's where I think, again, it's about prioritization and about resource allocation. So really making sure that governments have the manpower and the financial resources to throw just more people at this problem to really start to, again, disrupt as much as possible, knowing that you're not going to necessarily kill off a group immediately from the start, but that you can disrupt their activity and make it harder for them to reform, and do serious damage to how much money and how profitable they can be.
Right, right. That's a good end goal for sure. One area of improvement also that you talk about in the report is not just building awareness and encouraging proactive steps to kind of bolster resilience, but getting organizations to take that final step to take action. And I know CISA has done a lot over the past few years in this area. They've done their Shields Up, Shields Ready campaign. They've done their cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals. But you highlight that an important gap exists really between offering guidance to organizations and organizations actually taking action. And there's a lot of questions there about how we can best incentivize companies to take that action. What are the main ways that we can best approach this issue? Because it is kind of a fine line between offering best practices and guidelines versus actual requirements or having organizations take that step.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're seeing is, again, there's a lot of resources out there, and we like to talk about the flashy new, tactics, techniques, procedures that ransomware actors are using. But the bottom line is that a lot of these actors are not using very sophisticated means. They're still kind of getting at the, sort of. The what is it, sort of lowest lowest apple on the tree kind of issue. um, and so we I think have thought a lot about ways to incentivize preparedness, both on the government side and also for organizations. So we've talked in the report about alleviating fines for critical infrastructure organizations that meet certain cybersecurity progress, preparedness goals, and those need to be tailored sector by sector. Right now, I think we're seeing just not enough of that. So some of the standards are just too low or not feasible for organizations, and also there's not enough resources for them. And, if you're a small dairy farm in the middle of the country, cybersecurity probably isn't your top priority, but you're part of a critical infrastructure network that actually has a real effect on the U.S. economy. We've also looked at tax breaks as a potential incentive, and Maryland actually implemented a program a few years ago, and unfortunately it just wasn't well publicized enough, so not enough people were really taking advantage of it. So I think there are, both carrots and sticks that the government can use, and also the government needs to help fill in some of the resource gaps, which means putting money towards helping some of the under-resourced critical infrastructure sectors get there. Financial services has done a really great job of stepping up their cybersecurity, but food and agriculture and other education, Department of Health and Human Services, those are places where the networks are very, very broad, and there's a lot of other things going on and a lot of priorities, and cybersecurity isn't necessarily getting what it needs. I don't know, Megan, if you have anything to add.
I think the sort of tying this question around how do we get folks to implement can be connected also to the reporting requirements. So one of the goals is that once reporting is required under CIRCIA, that the government leverages that information not just to sort of have a near-term impact, but also to have longer-term impact on building the narrative that actually this idea that preparedness works. And I think some of the insurance companies have published recent reporting around what they're finding to be effective. We did a project last summer with Resilience there's a blog post about, we think that roughly 68% of ransomware incidents, I think, could have been blocked if the blueprint for ransomware defense had been implemented, or something like that. 68% effective.
Yep.
So there's more than just kind of the as Taylor kind of mentioned, the one-off impact that building a better case for preparedness can have. And we think that's an area where the government can really also step in as it gets more data.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay, great. One last question that I had was that, we are still seeing, like, 2 dozen or so of these recommendations needing to be more significantly implemented. What are some of the overarching challenges that exist, that are kind of preventing these from fully being deployed or implemented that you're seeing right now?
I mean, I think there's a big question around communication and messaging. I think there's a lot of resources out there, but there's also a lot of noise. And so, really honing like what the key takeaways are for organizations that want to up their cybersecurity. Really getting that messaging correct. So that folks understand, if they don't have a huge budget, how they can get involved. I think the other piece, as we've been talking about some of these reporting requirements, is also just making sure, we've seen this a lot with OFAC and the Treasury Department, as they've been trying to sort of streamline some of the reporting requirements around their ransomware payments. I think, regulators, law enforcement, there's still some animosity in the community around people feeling like they're going to be named and shamed, as opposed to like they can share what's happening with them, so that they can give everyone a better sense of what's going on, so that they can be part of a lessons learned, so that they can be helped. And so, I just don't think we're seeing enough of that right now. And I think that's on the government, that's on everybody to really think about how we sort of holistically kind of re-envision the way we're thinking about some of this incident reporting, so that, again, it's not about, pointing out the bad actors or the people who weren't prepared, but really actually getting everyone up to a good standard, and using that information that's really critical for the government to have, to accumulate, to actually know where we need to be putting resources going forward.
If I can, I offer one additional thought. I think that another piece of this question is around a number of these recommendations require legislative action, and Senator Lieberman just passed, but folks who were around in 2011 remember the Lieberman-Collins effort to try and get regulatory requirements set for critical infrastructure sectors. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet. And so I think there's, just to build a bit on Taylor's point, there's also some pushback from sectors recognizing that there are not significant resources for them to leverage to raise their own level of cybersecurity. So I think there's a concern that some of these requirements are particularly burdensome, especially in the particularly kind of cyber poor parts of the critical infrastructure sectors. But there's, I think we also, when we think about sort of some of the other recommendations that we made around grant funding and the like, think that these existing kind of outstanding recommendations can be paired together in a package, if you will, that could be effective, and hopefully, soon, maybe not this Congress, but in a future Congress, we'll see something like that come to place.
Definitely. Yep. Definitely something we'll be keeping an eye on there. So, all right. Well, Megan and Taylor, thank you so much for coming on today to talk a little bit about the Ransomware Task Force latest findings.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks.